Hi everyone, this is Alison Van Eenenham at UC Davis. We're going to be starting the webinar in a minute or two, but in the meantime, whilst you're getting settled, if you'd like to have a shot at a few quiz questions here, comparing the dairy industry in America and California to that of New Zealand, which will be very germane to today's discussion. So we'll get started here in about a minute or so. So please have a shot. I realize these are maybe questions you don't know the answer to, but give it your best guess and we'll see how close you get. All right, so what do we have to say here? So what percentage of US milk production was exported in 2019? The correct answer is about 15%. What percentage of New Zealand milk production was exported in 2019? The correct answer is 95%, which is pretty phenomenal. The value of New Zealand dairy exports, how did that get to be daily exports? Dairy exports exceeded the value of milk produced in California. True or false? That is true. In fact, it was about double the amount of, or the value of milk produced in California. Milking cows in California in 2019, the correct answer there is 1.726 million. So pretty close there. So that was the correct answer and we got the majority. And milking cows in New Zealand, only I think one got that right, and that is 4.92 million. So about what, 5 times the number in California or so. So okay, hopefully that was a bit of fun. So we're going to be talking today with Dr. Andre Mazzetto from Ag Research New Zealand on mapping the carbon footprint of milk for dairy cows. And Andre is a scientist at Ag Research in New Zealand, working with life cycle assessment of food production, especially in the pastoral sector of the dairy, beef and sheep animals. Andre's main interest is the sustainable intensification of food production, the impact and consequences of such strategies using a bird's eye view, not only on the environmental aspect, but also the effects on economic and social areas. So welcome to our series on animal agriculture and the environment. Thank you, Andre.
Thank you, Alison. Thanks for having me and the invitation. Happy to be part of the series and talk more about the research that we have been developing here in New Zealand. So as you mentioned, this is the a review that we performed mapping the carbon footprint of dairy cows. And just for a starter, I know, and we are all on the same page, I'll just briefly talk about what life cycle assessment is and how carbon footprint is connected to that. So life cycle assessment or life cycle analysis, since you guys are in the United States and both are okay, either way is LCA. There's as any scientific methodology or framework, we have protocols to follow, right? So as LCA actually has an ISO, International Standard Organization protocol that defines LCA and tell us how to perform an LCA. And by the definition of the ISO, life cycle assessment is a technique for assessing the environmental aspects and potential impacts associated with a product, a system, or a service. And although that's very accurate and correct, is a bit of the boring definition, I'll give you my definition of LCA. Basically, when you are performing a life cycle assessment, you are telling a story. And you can tell the story of anything you want. So if I'm, for example, telling your story, if I want to write your biography, I can ask you several questions about your life. I can focus in a specific time of your life, or I can tell the whole story of your life. And basically, I can actually start before you were born. Usually the question is, where were you born? I can ask you, where did your parents meet for the first time? And maybe you don't know the answer. Maybe you have to make assumptions, look at photos of the time. And that's a life cycle assessment. The final result depends basically in 2 main conditions. First is how good and accurate are the questions I'm asking you. Second is how good and accurate are the answers you are giving to me. So if you don't give me accurate answers, I won't tell your story correctly. So we can do this for nearly anything. Going from a product, for example, this computer that I'm using, we can go and tell the story of this computer, looking at every piece of it and checking where the products were extracted, how was the manufacturing, where this computer was manufactured, how it was distributed and came to me in New Zealand, my use of it, and when it finally dies, how will I dispose this computer. Sometimes you can even close the cycle, and when you have, for example, recycling some of the materials that are being used here. And as I mentioned, you can do that for anything. And based on that story, so you build a story of a product, a service, or a material, as the ISO definition mentioned. And based on that, you can analyze the environmental burdens of that product. So I'm listing here 4 of them, but there are many others. So this for the climate change is the most famous one, or the carbon footprint. Then you have water, land use, and resource depletion, that they are all global problems. But you also have some regional problems like eutrophication of rivers or acidification of rivers that could be analyzed using a life cycle assessment framework as well. So since we're talking about milk, what would be the life cycle assessment of a milk bottle or the milk production? It will start at the farm. Actually, it starts with the inputs of the products used in the farm. So if you're using fertilizer, we consider the emissions from the production of this fertilizer, or the fuel used in the farm, the feed production. You move to the farm level when you have the emissions from the animals and all the activities on the farm. And then you have the production. So you have the milk being transported to a processing plant, go for retail for you at your place, and then you dispose that packaging, or even you dispose the milk that was spoiled or something like that. So that's the red boundary that is you see there, is what we call cradle to grave. So we go the full life cycle of a product. And then there's also this blue dashed boundary called cradle to farm gate. And that's important for milk production, or for most of the ruminants as well, beef and sheep, because most of the emissions are at this blue boundary. For milk, about 75 to 85% of the total emissions of the cycle are on that boundary. And that's the reason why most of the studies focus on this part of the cycle. You see lots of studies on cradle to farm gates, and very few studies with the considering the all cycle, or the rest of the cycle of the milk. So if we focus, and I'll give you here New Zealand spin on farming, you have your main dairy farm, or the dairy platform, as they call here in New Zealand. But you also have, for example, a replacement farms that on the bottom of this diagram, where if you're not raising your replacements on your own farm, you need to buy the replacements for this farm. And that's part of the cycle. You cannot just ignore it. And then there's something here in New Zealand called the wintering off process, that during the winter months that we are coming now, the cows are all dried, and they move the cows for, especially in the South Island, they move the cows to a different farm where they will graze a winter crop, and they will be calving. And then the milk production resumes on August, September. So if we just look at the dairy farm or the milk platform, you are missing these other pieces of the cycle, even inside the farm gate boundary. And that's why it's so hard to compare. You need to be sure that people are considering the full cycle. So what we've done was, the initial idea was a meta-analysis, but we didn't have data enough. So we went for a structure review of the literature. And the goal was have robust and reliable comparison of the carbon footprint among or between different countries. So how we've done that. The first stage was, this was a cradle to farm gate LCA study. So we look at only that blue boundary at up to the farm gate. We selected studies in the literature that had the representative numbers of farms analyzed, and I'll discuss this a bit more in the next slides. And for comparing them in more fair manner, we selected standard factors, and we had some time to recalculate those factors to make them comparable. So as I mentioned, the first thing we've done was literature search, checking studies published as peer review, published scientific literature. At country level, they analyzed more than 100 farms, and this number can be a bit random. But what we've done is that if the study claim, if there's less than 100 farm and the study claimed that the sample was representative, or that specific region of the country was representative of the production of the country, we also included. So we have on the final study papers that have, for example, 45 or 28 farms, but they were in representative regions, or the authors claimed that the region was representative of the country. The second step was looking at those standard factors, and there are 3 of them. The first one is the global warming potential. So we basically analyzed 3 greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide. And you're probably aware of that. There's different assessment reports, these ARs, they are on the table, from IPCC, the International Panel of Climate Change. And over the time, these numbers were changing because science got better, we got more accurate or less accurate measuring this potential of warming of these greenhouse gases. So for example, if you look, and we selected here the AR4 2007, methane is 25 times more potent than carbon dioxide. So you multiply basically the result of methane by 25 to get standard CO2 equivalent, what is called greenhouse gases potential. And that's a lot of discussions. I will touch this later in the presentation, but I also know that you have Frank Miltoner and Ermias Cabra here in this series, and I'm sure they will explain that much better than me. So we selected the AR4. Why? Considering that AR5 is more recent. That's because most of the studies were performed at this point at AR4. Even some recent studies, they have AR4 numbers. So to avoid recalculating too much, we used AR4. And that's one example of a paper that the only thing we had to recalculate was the global warming potential. It was on AR5, 1.15, the original footprint. When we recalculated to the AR4, it came for 1.18. So it's not a significant or large impact on the final footprint. The second one was the functional unit. A carbon footprint is nothing more than the sum of all the emissions on the farm divided by something. And this something depends on what your products are. In our case, we're talking about milk. So it could be liters of milk, it could be kilograms of milk, it could be kilograms of fat and protein corrected milk, it could be kilograms of energy corrected milk. We selected fat and protein, FPCM, because first one is the recommended one by the International Dairy Federation. Second is because FPCM, it allows you to look at different breeds of animals and put them in the same standard. So different breeds of animals produce different milks with different amounts of protein and fat. So when you correct for that, you have them all on the same standards. And I just forgot to mention that on the last slide. What happens if the study didn't use FPCM, or if the study didn't use the AR4 that were selected? We try to look at the paper and find data to recalculate If the data was not there, we got in touch with the authors asking for supplementary data. So we went down trying to add as many papers as possible to this review. And that's here one example of the functional units. That the paper we had, the only thing we have to recalculate was the functional units. And you can see as well as the previous one, the GWP, the functional unit doesn't have a very strong effect on the final footprint. The last one, and the most important one, was the practice for allocation between milk and beef at the dairy farm. So in a dairy farm, you are not just producing milk, you are also producing live weight that can be sold for beef production. That will be direct beef production, for example, from cool cows, or you can sell the calves that can go for beef, for well, slaughter for veal, or for raising them for beef production. So there also, again, so there are different ways to allocate the emissions. So basically you calculate the emissions and allocate them between these two products at a dairy farm. There's energy allocation, could be economic allocation. The recommended one is biophysical. That is from, again, from the International Dairy Federation, the IDF, which means that we calculate based on the amount of the biophysical needs of the animal for growing and producing milk and producing beef. There's some equations to calculate that from the IDF. And again, we did the same as the others. If the study didn't use this allocation, we tried to calculate. If there was no, we applied the default allocation. The default allocation is that 85% of the total emissions goes to milk on a dairy farm. That can be higher or lower depending on how much beef you're producing on your dairy farm, but the default one would be 85, and we decided to apply that at the allocation. And this one is the most important. So as you can see, some of these studies, when we had to recalculate only the allocation for them, you can see that sometimes you have lower numbers from the original, the red to the blue. Sometimes you have similar numbers. Sometimes you have higher numbers. For example, the paper from China, from Wang, they were using economic allocation. And when you converted to biophysical, you actually get a higher footprint. And the paper from the left, which is mine, in Costa Rica, we were using energy allocation. And when you convert, you had, for biophysical, have a lower footprint. So this is the final flow diagram, if you like, of how the papers were selected and all the actions we took during this review. So what we got, and we found 86 papers at the beginning of our search, and after going through that flow diagram and getting in touch with the authors, getting extra data, supplementary data when necessary, we end up with 24 papers and fairly good geographical distribution, at least one paper from each continent of the world. Some countries had more papers, like New Zealand, Italy, and Ireland with 3 papers each, Australia and Peru with 2, and the others 1 each. So after performing all the recalculations, what were our results? That's the final chart comparing the countries, and there is a lot to unpack here. So I'll spend some time in this image. The first thing you see is that on the top there, with the highest numbers, up to 2 kilograms of CO2 equivalent per kilograms of fat and protein corrected milk, you have basically developing countries: India, Kenya, Costa Rica, and Peru. The second thing you see are is probably standing out a lot, are the standard errors. And that's because in the countries you have farms that are fairly effective and they are producing a low footprint. You have farms that are not so effective and producing more efficient, and producing a higher footprint. So, and that stands out a lot in the developing countries as well. So you see that's a very large standard deviation for Costa Rica and Kenya. The third thing here is that you have blue and red bars, and the red bars represent the countries that used the biophysical allocation. If you remember from a while ago, the biophysical was the one that had the strongest impact and the recalculation. So if you compare the red bars, you have a more fair comparison. We didn't have to consider recalculate the allocation for those countries. And also you see there are some hashes or bars with patterns. And those are the countries that use more emission factors that are regional or they're specific for their countries. And I'll have to stop here to explain a bit about emission factors. They are basically coefficients that allow us to convert the activity data into greenhouse gas emissions. So for example, if you know how much the type of fertilizer and how much fertilizer you're using on the dairy farm, you have an emission factor to convert that activity data, that number of kilograms of fertilizer, in greenhouse gas emissions, in nitrous oxide emissions that could be converted later for CO2. And there are basically two different types of emission factors. You have the default ones from the International Panel of Climate Change. So if you don't have specific factors for your country, which are recommended, you can use the default emission factors from IPCC. And although this is very handy, is at the same time, usually the default factors are higher than region specific. So for example, if you have research developed in your country looking at the fertilizer emissions on the pasture, and you can calculate emission factors specific for each country and use that in an LCA. So I'll just show an example here in New Zealand, because we do have this in New Zealand. We have specific emission factors for several of the activities on farm, because dairy, beef, sheep, they are very important here, and there's a lot of research going on. So this result 0.74 is different from the 7.7 you see. That's because that's the latest paper on New Zealand, the most updated, from Dr. Stuart Ledgard from AgResearch, published last year, and using the New Zealand specific emission factors. So you see that, as expected, enteric methane is the most important one here. About 65% of the total emissions are related to enteric methane. And what happens if we use the default emission factors or the default numbers from IPCC for the enteric emission? So one of the things that is important is the digestibility of the pasture when you're calculating the enteric methane. If we use the generic or the default data from IPCC, the number goes from 0.48 to 0.72, and that's a pretty strong impact on the final footprint. There's also some important factors. There are the nitrous oxide from the excreta or from the fertilizer emissions. So when you are applying fertilizer, nitrogen fertilizer, you have emissions of nitrous oxide. So what happens if we don't use the regional specific emission factors from New Zealand and we use the IPCC ones? That means almost 3 times the blue bar will increase. And if we put them together, the methane and the nitrous oxide, you see that there's a difference, big difference on the final footprint from 0.74 to 1.17. So even considering we did our best to calculate and standardize all the factors among those countries, but even though there's a deeper level that is very hard to go, because not all authors report all of their emission factors used, and basically this would mean that we have to redo all the studies to recalculate all of them with using the same emission factors and then having a perfect comparison. So that's why we're saying that what we've done was the best possible, because we cannot access this deeper level and put them all literally on the same page. There's another thing here, which is the land use change. And that's a bit controversial. So, for example, when you have land that is converted from forestry to pasture, that should be considered as well on the life cycle assessment of the milk production. So if we do that, and that happened in New Zealand over the last 20 years, that will increase the New Zealand number from the Stewart's last paper, 0.74 to 0.88. But this is based on land use change at the sector level. Normally, when countries are making this type of comparisons, you look at the country level. And if we do that for New Zealand, actually you get a net zero result, or a new number on that purple bar, because over the last 25 years, it happened afforestation. So on the dairy sector, yes, there were land from horticultural or from beef and sheep converted to dairy. But when you look at the country level, you had more forests being grown in New Zealand over the 25 years. So those are things that are a bit controversial, and there's a lot of discussions if we should look or not. So next one is just a different way to show these carbon footprints. And so you have on the y-axis the carbon footprint number, and on the horizontal axis the milk yield per cow. And if you look at the countries, that's the distribution. If you like statistics and you're looking for to fit a curve here, that's your curve, which is kind of expected. When you increase the milk production per cow, your footprint reduces. But there are some outliers that still, that's not a good comparison. We can improve that. And that's because of the whole difference between the greenhouse gases. As I mentioned, you have a webinar with Frank and Ermias, and they will touch on that. Basically, different greenhouse gases, they have different global warming potentials, as we've seen before, but they are different as well on their life cycle. So, for example, when we put fuel on our cars and we are burning this fuel, this is coming from, on the left side of this chart, this is coming from a carbon that was locked on the soil. We drill a hole to the ground, we extracted that carbon, and then we're putting it back to the atmosphere. And yes, this carbon will eventually come back to the soil, but that will take thousands, if not millions of years. And that's a long cycle of the carbon. That's different from when you have, for example, the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, which is absorbed by plants by a process we all know as the photosynthesis. And then you have the animal eating that pasture. The animal will convert that carbon in meat and milk, that's some excreta as well. And as ruminants, they will emit methane. So this methane will be emitted to the atmosphere after 15 to 20 years. This methane will be reconverted to CO2, and then we come full circle. This carbon will be absorbed by the plants, the animals will eat it. So it's a shorter cycle, and is a cycle that is both are natural, but is a shorter and natural cycle of the carbon. So that's an argument. If we need to consider that on the warming potentials. So should we consider that carbon dioxide from these fossil fuels are worst and giving less weight to methane, or acknowledging that methane has a short period of warming compared with the long period of the carbon dioxide? So here, what I've done was just it's the same chart, but what I call, that was a scatter plot. This is now a scatter pie. So you can see the different greenhouse gases and how they are and how they represent the portion that it represents on the footprint for each country. Just Germany and Denmark, we didn't have data for doing that. And since this is an important part, I'll take you step by step. The first group I wanted you to look is this one here on the corner. You see there are mostly European countries plus United States and Canada. And they have low carbon footprints. You see they are under 2 on the vertical axis. And they have a large production of milk per cow. So they are in the right corner of the horizontal axis. But what you see is also that when you look at the different greenhouse gases, they have almost an even distribution between them, or close less to 50% to methane. And that's because on these countries you have effect, for example, of the winter, you have more brothing feed for the animals, you have animals that could be indoors during a good part of the year, and then you have to deal with the manure management, which increases the emission from the nitrous oxide. And that affects the ratio of each greenhouse gas. If we look at the other side of the spectrum, the countries, there are the developing countries that have a high carbon footprint, so higher than 2, and low to medium production. You see that most of the emissions are related to the methane, because these countries are basically pasture-based. Their production is pasture-based, and they use very low feeding. They use and since it's pasture-based, they don't have many problems with nitrous oxide from manure management. And then you have other guys in the middle. And if you look at the under 1 on the carbon footprint, you see basically the 3 most famous one: Australia, Uruguay, and New Zealand. Ireland is close to that. But if you look at them, they are countries that are known for their pasture-based. They are known by being very efficient producing milk. And most of the emissions are related to methane. You have also emissions from nitrous oxide, less emissions from carbon dioxide from these countries. So when we consider this new metric of methane being having less warming, or having a less warming effect than the other gases, this distribution of the footprint is also important, and that's something that we are working now in checking how this metric can be applied for not just the dairy, but also other ruminants like the beef and the sheep sector. So what are the main conclusions from our study? Is that New Zealand showed the lowest carbon footprint on that, what we're calling the best possible comparison. It's not a perfect comparison. I would love to have a perfect comparison, but that would take redoing everything. And so, yeah, it's possible in the future, but someone very brave will have to do it, or with a lot of time. The second one is the allocation method is a key factor for the footprint. So yes, you can have different functional units, you can have different even global warming potentials, but the allocation should be the one that we are standardizing over all the studies. If we can have a standard for the 3 of them, functional units, allocation, and global warming, great. But if not, at least allocation should be the same for all studies. Third one is that region-specific emission factors are generally associated with lower footprints. So you're seeing, for example, New Zealand have these specific emission factors due to all the research that has been done over the last 20, 25 years in New Zealand. And that resulted in a lower carbon footprint as well. So more research on this for the other countries need to be developed. So we can, if we cannot compare them with all the full emission factors, at least we compare them with all of them having the same, not the same, but regional specific emission factors. So Ireland will have their, the United States will have their emission factors, New Zealand them, all specific and all validated by scientific research. And the last one is that countries show different greenhouse gas profiles, and that was the amount of methane or nitrous oxide or carbon dioxide, the distribution of these gases. And that's very relevant when we are considering these new metrics as being proposed for methane having a lower impact on the warming of the atmosphere. So thank you very much, and happy to get questions, and that's my email if you want to get in touch as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andre. We do have some questions, and there's actually two from Ermeus, and I'm going to give him the ability to ask them in person,
sure.
i.e. give him the ability to talk.
Yep.
So hopefully, oops, where did he go?
Okay, thank you, thank you, Alison. And thank you, Andre, for this clear and interesting presentation. I have a few questions, but I will limit it to just a couple of related questions. Yep. So what was the emission factor used for New Zealand? That's which is based on region-specific data. And which IPCC recommendation did you use? Did you use the updated 2019 or the 2006 recommendations?
Yeah, good question, Hermes. Thank you. Well, each one of the sources will have their emission factors, right? So if you have, for example, the urine from the animals or the dung, so we have research here in New Zealand done on these. So there are specific emission factors for example, even difference from the, well, that applies more for beef and sheep, but difference for the hill country from the flat country, or the lowland for the uplands. So that's each one. We, in this research from Stuart Ledgard, which was the most recent paper from New Zealand, we had 3 papers from New Zealand. The most recent one from Stuart uses all of the region-specific emission factors we have for New Zealand. So, for example, we have for the urine, for the dung, for nitrogen fertilizer, and also we have specific equations for methane as well, for enteric methane. So basically, we have a dry matter intake calculation that is used on the inventory of New Zealand, and that's multiplied by the factor that was defined by research here. And you had a second question, sorry?
Yeah, I was just wondering about the IPCC one. I mean, I'm asking this because there's such a big difference when you have the enteric. You know, it's like only 48% when you use the regional, and then when you use to IPCC, it went to 75 or something like that. So I was just wondering that, you know, there must be the YM value for New Zealand must be so low compared to IPCC, because in the IPCC, in the new one, I would think you would fall, because New Zealand, from the graph, it says it's less than 5,000 kilograms a year. So that would fall, as the YM value would be 6.5% of gross energy. Yes. But so the region specific one must be, I don't know, maybe 4 or something to have that kind of a big difference.
Yeah, about the enteric fermentation here in New Zealand, what we've done is looking at the dry matter intake calculation, and then you have a factor of methane per kilogram of dry matter, and that's almost, it's not a tier 3 approach. It would be like a tier, let's say 2.5, which I know it doesn't exist, but is different from the one from the IPCC, where you calculate, well, here you also calculate all the net energies for lactation, for pregnancy, for growth, but it's not, the YM is actually a factor of kilograms of methane per dry matter intake. So it is a bit different from the calculation from the IPCC. And about the difference between 2019, the refinement on 2019 compared with 2006, I've seen some of the new papers using the new factors, but all the papers that we look at this, they were all using 2006 values.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, we have a question. Is the afforestation that takes New Zealand's dairy-associated LUC to net zero attributable to dairies, or are those trees being counted by other industries too as offsets for their GHG emissions?
Oh, yeah, well, maybe I'll be a bit clear. That's is because the afforestation that is, the land use change should be counted, so that emission because of your changing land use and the carbon is being emitted is because of the change of, let's say, horticulture to dairy or even forestry to dairy, if that happened. So that's when we account for the emissions. When we look at these afforestation, is basically saying that at the net level, New Zealand didn't have change, increased the forestry. So we put a zero. We are not accounting for this carbon being sequestered, the sequestration of the carbon by the trees. Here, most of the trees are in beef and sheep farms. So there are trees on dairy, but most of them, especially in the hill country, are in beef and sheep. So they use more, they have this argument of, yes, our trees are sequestering carbon, so we have a negative value that could be applied to our footprints. And that's something we are exploring here, but it's not a standard practice on LCA. So we usually put this as sensitivity analysis. So we have, for example, if we are considering the carbon being sequestered by the trees and having a negative impact, so having a negative number, reducing the footprint, that is not officially on the life cycle assessment, but you can have a sensitivity analysis and apply that to the number as well.
Okay, there's another question here. How can allocation method beef/milk be standardized across countries if there are very different average lifespans for the animals?
Good question. What happens is that these factors, the biophysical allocation, is basically an equation considering the amount of milk produced in 1 year and the amount of live weight exported during that year. So I agree that different countries they will have different slaughtering times or lifespan of the cows. Some countries will have cows for 7, 8 years, others will have 4 years of production. But that was one of the ways looking at yearly basis. So you have different animals with different ages there. The other one could be considering the lifespan of one cow. So if you have a cow of 4 years of production, then you have a cow cow for beef production. You look at the whole emissions during this time of the lifetime of one cow. That could be one way, but it's very challenging. It's something that there's a lot of discussions, and people use different allocations because of different goals. So sometimes you want to look more at the specifically on the milk, they will use a different allocation, or sometimes they are looking at specific economic values, so they will use economic allocation. What is being suggested is if your study has one goal, specific goal, and you want to use economic allocation, yes, go for it, but also apply the biophysical, and you can put that as like supplementary material information. So we all have the same numbers later to compare.
Okay, next one. How do management factors such as increased use of beef semen by dairy herds, productive life/cull rates impact, or how could they impact your results?
They won't impact much on the milk production, but they will impact a lot on the beef production. So for example, if you are using artificial insemination of beef breeds on the cows and you are raising calves, those calves for beef production, because of the allocation on the milk, this calf, the meat coming from these dairy farms, they will have a lower footprint than a traditional beef or a beef only farm, because you have the allocation between milk and beef there. So it's been shown, there's a new paper from people in the Netherlands, and Stuart Ledgard here from MagSearch is a co-author here in New Zealand. If we get all of those bobby calves from the farm and raise them as beef animals, that will reduce the beef footprint by about 20%. So not necessarily an impact on the dairy, but a strong impact on the beef footprint. And they are interconnected. Sometimes we look at just the dairy sector, beef sector, but we need to look at them together as well, as a system, as a livestock, as a cattle system, rather than just individual sectors.
All right, but they keep on coming. So this is, the calculations are appropriate emissions per unit of product. But if you multiply those values for the countries by their total production amounts, how do the countries rank on total emissions?
Yep, and that's something also controversial. It means, for example, the result of the carbon footprint is a measure of efficiency, basically. So as you know how much kilometers per liter you can go in your car, the carbon footprint is the same. It's the emissions per kilograms of product. So we haven't done this calculation that you mentioned. So we know that New Zealand is has the lowest carbon footprint. If we multiply that by the production, it doesn't mean that necessarily we are emitting less than Costa Rica or Peru, but it means that we are more efficient producing that product. So we haven't done this calculation. That's a good question. But is the idea of the carbon footprint is a measure of efficiency, not as total emissions, but is a relevant calculation. I agree. Mm-hmm.
Could I be given permission to share a slide that might actually address that question for you?
Yep.
So this is from Gleam, and hopefully that's showing on your screen, is it?
Mm-hmm.
Yes. Is that what you're seeing? That
no.
the image? Sorry.
Yeah, I see that.
Okay. Yeah.
Continents.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that answers your question, perhaps. And it's a factor of both efficiencies, but also animal numbers, which we haven't really got into here. But when you've got very inefficient animals and lots of animals, then obviously you have a lot of emissions, even though you might not have much product.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
So I just thought that was a relevant little slide. Another question here. Is the conversion factor more affected by the regional climate and or genetics?
When you mentioned, sorry, just clarification, conversion factor is the emission factor?
I'm guessing they probably meant emissions factor. Johan, do you want me to let you live so you can talk? Johan Bol, if you want to talk,
yes,
you can.
Yes, I just got that here. I just mean from, you know, you get all these factors, right? And you're saying, well, we have like 1.18 or, you know, and it goes up. It seems like the medium or the lower, the countries with the lowest conversion or with the better conversion factor, I guess that's what it is actually. They seem to be more in a more moderate climate than what we have here in the US. We have like very hot, very humid, you know, all kinds of climates combined. So I thought, well, maybe that has something to do with that conversion factor, or is it more with impacted with genetics that we can do better with going forward?
Yeah, well, talking specifically about the animals, not considering like because for nitrogen, there's questions about the soil type, soil texture, so that influences the amount of greenhouse gases you emit by the soil. So specifically about the animals, yes, there's something that is being done here recently. It was done for sheep. So on the lamb industry, they are artificially selecting animals that emit lower less greenhouse gases. So they're measuring emissions from individual animals, selecting those animals, and artificially selecting them for being as the breed to grow. They are starting to do that with dairy and beef as well. So yeah, you can have this impact of the genetic selection and having animals that are more efficient, or they using the jargon that Ermias used, the YM value, which is the amount, the percentage of the total energy that is converted on methane. You have a lower value than the normal, the other breeds. So yeah, genetic has a point, it could be relevant for reducing the total emissions of the animals.
Okay, and what about the regional climate? Does that seem to have an effect also?
I'm not sure about the animal themselves. The climate would influence the emissions from the soil. So nitrogen from the soil, from the nitrogen fertilizer, or the urine, or the dung, or when you are applying the manure management, the manure from as fertirrigation, for example. So the type of soil, the amount of water, the water hold capacity of the soil, that will influence, and that's where the climate can play a role. I'm not sure about the animals. You have some, in some countries, for example, I did some work in Costa Rica, that you had the heat stress on the animals, and that can reduce the production of milk. So that can be an impact on the carbon footprint as well.
And there was a question, one of your early slides showed the different countries, and there were standard error bars for some countries, but not for others. And why was there not one, for example, for America?
Because there was only one study, and they didn't have the, there was one value. So when some studies, when we have like three, like for New Zealand, we had a error bar. So there were 3 studies. We calculated a weighted average based on the number of farms. So each study had an average. We calculated the errors and the final average as a weighted. When a few other studies, for example, they have only one number. So we didn't have an error bar for that specific study. Even so just to complement that, like Costa Rica was only one study as well, but we have different types of farm on this study. So then we had like more intensive production, more extensive production in uplands, production in lowlands. So then we calculate an average for the country in the same study.
Well, you've managed to get through all of the questions that were posted to the group, so that's well done. And I'd like to thank you very much for participating in our seminar series here. I think it's really interesting to listen to all of the different dimensions that go into these calculations, and the comparison, I think, particularly between the pastoral systems and the more intensive systems it's an interesting discussion, the intensive versus extensive, and which is the more quote unquote sustainable system. And I think California and New Zealand could not be more different in that regard, except perhaps some of the coastal communities. And so it's an interesting tension. Yeah.
And there's the discussion only by cattle milk, right? We have others like sheep milk, goat milk, plant-based milk. So that those all can, you have also these tensions on the market. And yeah, we are starting and trying to do some research on that as well. But yeah, it's very challenging, and there's an area that is growing fast. So we need a lot of people and more people working on it.
Great. Well, thank you very much. And thanks for everybody that attended this webinar. As you will recall, if you're part of the program, UC A&R program teams for livestock and dairy, we have a meeting following this with the topic focus being animal welfare. And you should have been provided a separate Zoom link. It's the same Zoom link as you got last week to go to the program team meetings. If you want to go to that and you haven't, you can sign up at the survey that's linked there. But Thank you again, Andre, for taking time on your Saturday, and we enjoyed seeing your cats in the background there. It gave us some interesting visuals whilst you were talking. So it's always fun to catch up with people's pets.
Yep.
So
thank you very much.
I'll bid you good morning and thank you again.
Yep. Good afternoon to you all. Thank you very much. Have a good day. Bye-bye.
Bye.